Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first ever online virtual seminar by Rapid Flight Training. I want to welcome you to, we're broadcasting, I guess, tonight from Indianapolis, Indiana, and the topic of tonight's webinar is winter flight safety. Now, the way we're going to run this webinar is we're going to replay portions of a in-person seminar that we gave last week. We do that so that we can control the edit of the video and the quality of the audio so that we get the content across the way that we want to. In between, we're going to be playing a YouTube video that highlights some safety messages and some aspects of tonight's seminar. And then lastly, we'll finish this up with some question and answer. So feel free to use the text service that you should see on the YouTube Live. And at the end of this, I'll come back on the screen live here and we'll go through questions that you might have. I'm also in a position to be able to do a demonstration of the different services and briefings that we are planning to show tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to start the first session of our in-person winter flying safety seminar from last week here in Indianapolis. And I'll be back with you live to transition from from session one into the YouTube video that we're going to discuss later. Technical training session of Rapid Flight Training. So you guys are in a very elite group of people. I don't have any ticket stubs or anything like that, but just Matt will take some pictures to memorialize it. My buddy Matt, he's also a pilot as well. So we're gonna film this because we're going to use some of this for online webinars. So we're going to broadcast the same thing and make use of some of this training to augment how we share this training with people outside of just Indianapolis. So, all right. So, got a presentation I'll roll through. Like I said, two 40-minute segments. We'll do some question and answer at the end, just because of the way we're filming this. So, if you got a question, if you don't mind, just kind of keep in mind, and then we'll use a mic so that we're getting good audio to be able to capture the question and be able to capture the answer as well with you guys. So, sound good? So, first, quick background on me. Professionally, I've been a pilot since 2016. I grew up flying in float planes with my dad, though. So I got the bug at about a 10-year-old kid flying a 182 float plane and 172 float plane up into... All right, can everyone hear me okay with the ventilation going on? Am I projecting sufficiently? All right. So my flying background is 2016 as a kid, 2016 as a private pilot. I got my private in about 4 or 5 weeks. I went on and did my instrument in about 4 weeks after that. And then the following year I did my commercial. And then this year with COVID, I made a career decision to focus on aviation, which is really my passion. Previously, I was in the mining business. I co-led the development of 2 different mining companies going back about 11 years. The companies that we started produce iron ore, which for those that aren't familiar with iron ore, it's the raw material in steel. So we made something that everybody uses, which is kind of nice. The last project we did was up in Labrador, Canada, which is what brought me into aviation and to use it for business. I wanted to be able to commute and control my schedule versus be subject to the commercial airlines going all the way up into Labrador. That takes me to another part of my journey to this point that really has made an impact on me, and that I know will have an impact on how I teach students and interact with students I'm one of the 100 or so people that have survived a plane crash using the Cirrus CAPS parachute. And that occurred on a trip from Indianapolis up to Labrador, Canada, and I was returning from Labrador, Canada back to Indianapolis. I was en route from Wabush Airport to Quebec City when I had a catastrophic engine failure in the middle of nowhere. And as you can see from the picture, I was very lucky to survive because a tree came right through the bottom of the airplane and came inches from ending my life very rapidly. So I was fortunate and I was prepared. And this will be subject of a future seminar, is talking about risk management from a CAPS Cirrus standpoint, as well as survival in terms of if you have a plane crash, what are things that I think of now that I wouldn't have thought of before this event happened to me. So that'll be a future topic that we'll talk about in due course. And now I'm a flight instructor. And what I'm focused on, and Anyone recognize the picture? You look handsome, Dave.
I look better than the guy next to me.
Not bad, not bad. So Rapid Flight Training is a flight business that's focused on only accelerated flight training. One of the things that I've seen consistent throughout a lot of flight schools that aren't 141 flight schools, aren't focused on creating airline pilots, is naturally staffed by people that do flight training on the side, maybe retired people, maybe a young person out of college that's passing through in the summertime to build time. There are a few accelerated programs out there outside of 141 training, but not many. And what our goal is to develop a reputation for being the premier instrument training center for someone that wants to get their instrument rating done in as little as, let's say, 7 days for someone that's got a fair amount of experience and more of a finish up with their instrument time and their test taking. All the way up to, let's say, 3 weeks if someone's focused on it, if they're coming in fresh, just straight out of their private pilot. What differentiates Rapid Flight Training, and this will be the only commercial for today, is just this slide right here, is we're one of the few accelerated programs that does not require passing the knowledge test ahead of time. We do that very specifically because I believe there's a missed opportunity to integrate the preparation for the knowledge test with the day-to-day flying and the day-to-day preparation for your check rides. And so we integrate that all together on a day-by-day basis into each day of the curriculum at Rapid Flight Training. That's one thing that differentiates us. So enough of the commercials. Let's talk. We're here to talk about winter flying. We're going to touch on some of the lighter stuff, the stuff that won't kill you, but the stuff that might hit your pocketbook in terms of what impacts the maintenance costs and issues and reliability with your airplane. Maybe some things that could end up with an embarrassing accident, but probably survive. And then we'll touch on the more serious stuff. And we're gonna watch a video of a really tragic story of a TBM that crashed. Some of you may have seen this video from the Air Safety Institute before. But we're gonna touch on that and then touch finally on icing and how to mitigate that risk with all of the information that's available to us these days as pilots. We've got a mix of experience levels in the room, so I'm going to try to, one thing I'm definitely going to focus on is some technical stuff on icing and ice avoidance, but we're going to weave in some private pilot stuff here in terms of VFR flying in winter conditions, because I think there might be some opportunities for some VFR flying more than people realize and be in a safe environment. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So, first thing let's talk about is cold starts. You know, one thing that is, by a show of hands, anyone read any books by Mike Bush? By chance, one show of hands. So there's a great, I really enjoy it, and if you want to talk after, a book I highly recommend. It's all about engines by Mike Bush. Mike Bush is a very well-renowned mechanic that speaks, that has several books, very active online, social media. He's flown for many years a twin-engine 310, and he runs Savvy Analysis. So Savvy is a online company where you can send your engine data and they'll analyze it, et cetera, et cetera. But the point we're talking about here is the impact that winter can have on engine wear. And as you can see in the quote below, per Mike Bush, one improper cold start could have as much wear as 500 hours of normal cruise. Why is that? Well, it's because of the tolerances in an engine. All of us aren't mechanical engineers, but what we probably can understand is that metal expands when it gets hot and it contracts when it's really cold. And when we think about the tolerances of our aircraft in terms of the main shafts, the bearings, as well as the lifters and rockers, some of which operate without any lubrication, the impact of a cold start is extremely detrimental on the engine. Some people think that the cause or the source cause of the negative impacts is just thick oil that's not very viscous, but what it really is the expanded, the contracted metal on metal contact and the lack of clearances that you have when you execute a cold start. So key point number one from this seminar is rule of thumb below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, never start your engine if it's cold soaked at a below 40 degree level. If it's going to be a cold night, if it's going to be you're not sure what the weather is, there's ways to mitigate that risk, and there's typically options. For me personally, I've only owned, and I would only own aircraft that have at least oil pan or cylinder head heaters. There's two types. There's the most common oil pan heater, but you can also get dual systems that have a heater at the bottom, but also that are plugged into the cylinder blocks as well to provide even more heat into that engine. If you're going on a cross country and it's wintertime, think ahead about what can happen with the weather and with the temperatures. Maybe the airport that doesn't have a heated hangar or an FBO with that type of facility is not the best choice. Yeah, it might have gasoline that might be 50 cents cheaper, but when we think about the wear that you can have from a single cold start, it's going to be well worth that investment to planning your cross-country, winter cross-countries to have those facilities. I've learned as a novice pilot, I've learned from firsthand experience. I'll tell a story since we're here located in Indianapolis. Hendricks County Airport, just west of the city of Indianapolis, is a relatively rural airport that does not have any heated hangar facilities. Several years ago, I flew my whole family from Minnesota to Hendricks County Airport because it was the closest airport to my in-laws. I did not think about the weather that was going to come. And to simplify a longer, painful story for me, we landed, weather was fine. It was, I think, this time of year. And I believe it was Thanksgiving. And over the course of Thanksgiving, we ended up getting basically an ice storm like we had on Monday night of this week. So I'm stuck with a Cirrus SR-22 that's covered in frozen, honeycombed ice all over the entire airplane, with an airport that doesn't have any de-icing capability and an airport that doesn't have any heated hangar capability. So what do you and the temperatures are below zero outside. So what does a person do? Well, you go to Walmart and you get 5 hair dryers and you spend about 3 days blow drying your airplane off to get the ice off. That's what you do when you don't have those kind of facilities. So learn from me, it's well worth selecting airports that have heated hangar facilities, or if not, make sure you're confident in the weather that you're not going to have a snowfall, because even a dry snowfall in certain parts of the country can turn into a wet partial melt, and that can turn into a complete layer of ice on your wings. So, okay. So engine starts, we're dealing with airframe contamination there a little bit too, but the concept of having a heated hangar can play into the flight planning for avoiding those cold starts as well. So very important to think ahead about potential contamination on the airframe, number one. Number two, don't get stuck in a situation where you have to start your aircraft below 40 degrees with a cold soaked engine. All right, very, very damaging. By show of hands, I know one person's got a full engine monitor, 2 people. What level of monitoring of your cylinder head temps in the wintertime is customary for when you're flying? Is it something that is on top of mind? Bill, Connor, are you thinking about this, like cylinder head temps and the outside air temperature at all when you're flying? At cruise. Not usually. Okay. So point number 3 and 4 here are related to cylinder head temperatures. Okay. In a modern aircraft that has, so let's back up to more typical. Let's think of a Cessna Piper type aircraft that might have a single cylinder head temp reading. Typically that type of a cylinder head temperature reading is either an average or it's a thermocouple, a sensor that's in one of the cylinders. So number one, it's an estimate of what is happening in your cylinder head temps. So outside of winter operations in those types of aircraft, you could have issues with detonation, pre-ignition, things like that going on, and it would be very difficult to diagnose those issues until you have a serious issue with your engine, with your power generation. Okay? In case of winter with much colder outside air temperatures, exceedingly cool cylinders can lead to an issue where lead oxides can become deposited on your valve stems. What's a valve stem? So in our piston engines, the exhaust gases from our engine leave the piston through a valve that's opening and closing very quickly, 25 times an hour. And in very cold temperatures, you run the risk of depositing lead, which, with these very tight clearances that we talked about earlier, can lead to what's called stuck valves. And stuck valves can turn into something very catastrophic in terms of engine failure. In fact, I don't know exactly what the cause of my crash was, but I hypothesize potentially stuck valve could have been one of the source causes, and not diagnosing a stuck exhaust valve over a certain amount of time may have been the source cause of my catastrophic engine failure. So running exceedingly cool cylinder head temps runs the risk of lead contamination within your cylinders, which degrades the clearances and the valves, which can lead to potentially stuck valves and, best case, cylinder replacements, worst case, catastrophic engine failures. That's number one. Number two, in the summertime, our piston engines rely on oil temperatures that are high enough to evaporate a lot of the water in the crankcase and allow that water vapor to escape via the breather. Why is that bad? Water vapor contained and trapped contained water contained in the oil can react with other resultants from the combustion process and create some nasty actors within the engine. And so from a longevity standpoint, it's also very important for getting maximum life out of an engine to ensure that cylinder head temps are run hot enough so that as oil recirculates through the engine and then back through the oil cooler and then back through the engine, that you have a boiling point. And of course, that boiling point can change with altitude. That's why water boils different when we're in the mountains than when we're down. So we have some wiggle room there as we're flying at higher altitudes. But the point is that cylinder head temps is a very important topic that I don't think many people, myself included, earlier in my flying career, paid much attention to. So let's recap. Cold starts, very bad for the engine, very, very harmful. Don't get stuck in a cold soak situation in the wintertime having to start an engine. Servo control, I put that up there because I've actually lost control of my autopilots because of extreme cold. With where I've flown in my career, I've had times where my servos would not react because the outside air temperature, I believe, was about minus 40 Celsius Fahrenheit, which they're getting close to the same at that point. And so there are temperatures in a general aviation aircraft. They're not designed to fly at flight levels like jets where that type of equipment will actually start to fail on you as well. Kind of a minor point. Condensation from avionics damage, and then lastly, monitoring cylinder head temps to evaporate the water and to avoid the risk of lead buildup within your cylinders and your valve stems. And the way that you can monitor that or manage that is to ensure that we're running high enough power in the wintertime, rich at peak, and that we're running rich enough on takeoff and full power climb to make sure that we're keeping those cylinder head temps high enough. There's also mitigants in terms of blocking off part of the cowl inlets. Some manufacturers like Cirrus make factory devices, which I had to use quite often with where I was flying, to something as someone that might be taking a trip around the country to think about in terms of cylinder head temps, and especially at cruise and wintertime conditions in a Fiki airplane. Keep that top of mind in terms of cylinder head temps. There's a lot of information out there. We don't need to go through it here today about what are the right range. Generally speaking, what I understand, and from my own experience and what I've read, it's about 320 to 380 degrees is where you want to be, with Lycoming's engines being a little more tolerant on the high end for summertime. But prolonged periods well below 300 degrees on cylinder head temps is not a good thing. Okay, so we got a picture here of a famous runway excursion at Chicago Midway. For those that have flown into Midway, it's not shocking that something like this would happen. I believe this was about 4 years ago, where Southwest Airlines landed on slush runway conditions, was unable to stop, and just slid through the fence and across the street in urban Chicago. So in the Midwest, we don't get significant snow accumulations like some areas of the country do. But for those people that may be in a northern part of the Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, in the Northeast, or in Canada, in the mountains, snow removal is a big problem and a big challenge for airports. And most airports I've been into with winter flying, they do a good job of managing the lighting systems, but you can get into situations where there's some snowbanks that are hidden on some corners tucked away in between the lights or in between certain areas. As a flight instructor, we teach all of our students to keep your head out whenever you're moving. If you're moving, the head's out. If your airplane's stopped, that's when you can look in the cabin, program your GPS, look at checklists. In the wintertime, that is even more important to avoid a potential wingtip strike or worse, getting stuck. Again, this isn't something that we're talking about a fatality here, but something that could be very expensive, very difficult on the wallet, very embarrassing because it's completely avoidable. On a related topic, to move on from taxiways, runway conditions. As an earlier pilot, that was something I never paid any attention to. I was flying in and out of airports with slushy runways all the time and didn't think twice about it. In a GA aircraft, there's more flexibility there, but as a person gets into more advanced systems, faster, heavier airplanes, runway conditions become a significant item. So where do we get the data for runway conditions? Well, there's multiple places. Number one, air traffic control will keep a data. If there are less than dry runway conditions and you're coming into towered airports through a terminal approach control, you will have the ability to get the runway conditions from air traffic control if you're flying IFR or if you're flying with VFR, talking to them with flight following. Also check NOTAMs, Noticed Airmans. Noticed Airmans can list the runway conditions for airports that you're going into, and with the ability through ADS-B now to get more and more data in real time, there's no excuse anymore to get stuck and surprised with coming into a slushy runway. What are those runway condition reports? Well, it's a simple numerical system of 0 through 6. 6 is dry, 0 is not dry. Okay, so and the runways are reported in three segments of the runway: approach, center, and departure end. So there's a 3-number code for runway conditions, from a number of 6 to 0, 6 being good, 0 being very bad. And so just to highlight a topic that many may not have on top of mind. And the last point on runway and taxiway excursions is focus energy flying. So focus in terms of taxiing operation, head out of the cockpit, sterile cockpit, no distractions. Don't get stuck with an embarrassing moment with a snowbank or getting stuck. Number 2, energy management. Coming into a slushy runway, even in a GA aircraft, coming in a little fast, energy is a function of the velocity squared. So when you have marginal to poor braking action or surface friction conditions, it's a good time to try to practice more of a short field approach technique, manage that energy, come in a little slower, give yourself more flexibility on that runway. And then the third thing is flying. Touched on it before. Don't stop flying the airplane until the airplanes come to a dead stop. I've been into many slushy runways where it's dancing pedals on the rudders the whole way because the wheels aren't doing much and all you have is the rudder behind you to keep you from sliding into a snowbank on one side or the other. One of the airports I flew into often was in Sept-Îles, Quebec, which is on the north shore of the St. Lawrence Seaway. They get over 300 inches. They convert to centimeters, I don't know what it is, but they get over 300 inches a year of snow, and they get winds up to 30, 40, 50 knots. So you can imagine the snowbanks and the snowdrifts that airport generates. Within that airport facility, I would regularly see snowbanks of in excess of 10 to 15 feet tall. So, runway and taxiway excursions. Make sure I haven't missed anything here. All right, basic icing theory. This is going to hark back to some of private pilot days and some ground school days, and we're going to talk a little differently about how we think about ice. Because many of us learned the two conditions you need for ice to exist is you need a temperature below 32 degrees Fahrenheit and you need visible moisture. While that statement in itself is true, it's actually much too broad of a definition for defining where ice is. And so the way I like to define icing is the two conditions that you need is you need supercooled liquid water content. Let me say that slower. Supercooled liquid water content, which is one of two types of water content that you can have in the atmosphere. And you need to have a temperature that's in the ice zone. And we'll talk a little more about what that is. So we're changing our thinking from below 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit and visible moisture to where are we going to find the more significant liquid water content that's super cooled, and what are the corresponding temperatures associated with that. So what's an example for our VFR pilots that are here of a situation where you might have below freezing temperatures, visible moisture, but you're not going to have icing? It may be, if visibilities and ceilings are high enough, it may be a perfectly safe condition to fly in. Snow. I've flown through many of a snowstorm and I've never picked up ice once. And the reason is because it's not liquid water, and that's the reason. It's not liquid water. Only liquid water is super cool. Liquid water is going to adhere to the surface of an aircraft. All right, let's review. So as part 2 of this seminar, we're going to get into the weather forecasting, Skew LogP charts, and the whole point of that second segment of this discussion is to identify where are there areas of more supercool liquid water, and how do we identify where the temperatures are in the ice zone, which is really it's 0 degrees C to about minus 18 degrees Celsius. That's the ice zone. So call it at the freezing point, all the way to minus 20 is where the majority of supercooled liquid water resides. You can have supercooled liquid water all the way up to, in certain cases, minus 40 C, but it's not very common. The reason that we get supercooled water in the atmosphere, in clouds, is the same reason that water beads up on your car after a fresh wax, surface tension. So that natural surface tension that wants to beat up the water in the air is fighting the forces of the crystals to try to form that ice. And so with energy and mixing and updrafts and upward unstable air in combination with surface tension, you get a situation, unfortunately for aviation, where within that temperature band, supercooled liquid water is more of the norm versus the exception when we're flying. The last two things I want to review is just for all of our refresher, the types of ice. We have 3 types. Rime ice. Rime ice is defined as really being opaque ice, meaning it's hard to see through. It's less serious in terms of the disruption that it makes to airflow over the wings and the lifting surfaces. And it has that opaque color because rime ice is built off of the smallest liquid water particles. So very small droplets of water forming into ice on the leading edge, typically of the airfoils, and you get air trapped in between, which creates that opaque color. So that's rime ice. Mixed ice is a mix of rime ice and a mix of clear ice. Clear ice, as the name suggests, is ice like we see on hockey rinks and lakes. Maybe not in Indiana, but other places I've lived. It's just normal non-air entrapped ice. Mixed ice is going to be that mixture of rime ice with mixed ice, which gets back to the quantum of supercooled water and the size of the droplets that water is coming in contact with. We have 4 levels of icing. We have trace, light, moderate, and severe. In my experience, when I've seen aviation forecasts for trace icing, I don't think I remember a time where I've picked up ice in those situations where the the rate of ice accumulation exceeds the rate of sublimation of that ice evaporating naturally off of the airplane as it's flying. So in my experience, at least, trace forecasts of ice rarely results in icing. I've never experienced that personally. Light icing is typically associated with small amounts of rime ice buildup. Moderate icing is defined as a situation for an aircraft without any anti-ice capability. Moderate ice is really defined that if that airplane is within that type of icing for even a short amount of time, it becomes a serious flight hazard. So for most of us flying Cessnas, Pipers, Skyhawks, light icing can be very dangerous. If you're flying in moderate icing, that's extremely dangerous. Severe icing is defined as dangerous icing even for aircraft that have flight into known ice certified systems. So severe icing is truly the most severe scenarios. The video that we're going to watch is going to be an example of where a very capable airplane with a very experienced pilot, but unintended slow decision making, maybe a few human factors of our hazardous attitudes came into play, and severe icing took down a very capable aircraft in this situation. So let's review before we watch the video what does icing do to the airplane. First and foremost, it increases drag, and that is the most significant consequence of picking up ice, which therefore the most meaningful symptom of picking up ice is losing airspeed. So for IFR pilots that are out there that are avoiding ice, not thinking they're going to be in ice, but perhaps you're an IMC, the single thing to focus on to if you can't see the wing, to identify ice is loss in airspeed. And it can happen extremely fast. As a personal story, I was flying my non-certified for known ice airplane above a cloud deck on a flight. It was over Marquette, Michigan, over the UP of Michigan. So a very moist area with Lake Superior right there. And I was on top of the clouds. I was not certified to fly into known icing. And just in my scans of my instruments and my engine, I inadvertently started to dip into the very top of the cloud layer for probably 45 seconds or a minute, where I'm in and out of the clouds a little bit. I didn't notice it right away. My head was inside the cabin. But when my head was inside the cabin, I lost 25 knots of airspeed in less than a minute. The icing at the top of clouds is the most extreme icing in either a stratiform, kind of a thin cloud layer, or some more upward vertical cloud types. The tops of the clouds are by far the most significant icing because those are the tops of the updrafts. That's where the largest supercooled droplets, if they're going to exist, they're going to be at the very top of the cloud. You also have the lifting motion from the condensation that releases energy at the very top. So for me, just dipping into those clouds for a very short amount of time, it was definitely moderate icing. Probably not severe, but moderate icing in an airplane that's not equipped for it, without any of my inadvertent icing systems, TKS turned on, and 25 knots of airspeed was lost in less than a minute, as an example. So with that increased drag, part and parcel of that comes a disrupted airfoil. So the airflow around the wing becomes disrupted, therefore the critical angle of attack, so the angle that airfoil is compared to the relative wind that is flying through, becomes lower. That wing will stall at a lower angle of attack than if it was clean. You combine high drag with a earlier stall situation, and it can become a very dangerous situation. One thing that is not understood to be a significant contributor to loss control is the weight of the ice. It's my experience and my understanding that the weight of the ice is very immaterial compared to the loss of drag and the disruption of airflow, which reduces your critical angle of attack of your wing. Pedostatic errors. we're diving way back into our private pilot ground school here. Let me give you a first-hand story in a certain 413 Alpha Kilo, flying from Quebec City. I was leaving Quebec City in and I was trying to depart ahead of a known ice storm that was coming in. It was conditions that were roughly around 32 degrees. It was forecast of a front moving through, so freezing rain was going to come through, and I had a window to get out. But in Quebec City, you have a lot of snow and you have a lot of blowing snow. So there was a situation where at the airport, snow was being blown in slightly above freezing conditions overnight, and those conditions went into freezing. So there was a little bit of ice contamination on the airplane, but not so much I thought that was a real issue. But as it turned out, the little specks of ice that were on the airplane, one of those little specks of ice found itself right into the static port of the airplane. So, for me, what I experienced was on a takeoff roll, an airspeed that jumped up really fast, and I didn't catch it right away. I just was not I'd been flying a lot, not paying attention to that, to the point where I felt like the plane was ready to fly because my indicated airspeed was 70, 75 knots, and in actuality, I was probably going 45, 50 knots. So started to try to lift the plane off the runway. Stall horn went off, immediately stalled right back down to the runway. It was a very wet, the runway conditions were a 2 or a 3 because of this kind of quasi-melting blowing ice. So I didn't have a lot of runway. I didn't feel like I could actually stop. I continued the takeoff and knew at that point I couldn't trust my airspeed indicator at all, so I had to just fly the airplane by feel. And so I lifted off and knew that I had enough airspeed to fly. But then the next issue I had is I had been released on an IFR departure, and there was IMC right there. So I had to make a quick decision. Am I going to try to come back down, or am I going to continue the flight? I was able to figure out pretty quickly that it was a static port. And so thankfully in a Cirrus airplane, you have a knob right there by your feet. I switched to alternate static, and boom, airspeed came right up, and all was good. So not a real serious incident. That's why you have alternate static ports. But I give that story just to highlight that even a little speck of ice on the airplane might find its way into those static ports. So it's important to carefully check the static ports. It's not just a checklist item that we kind of walk through. Physically look at them, see if you see any ice in those ports. I know from firsthand experience. Roll upsets is a condition where the disrupted airflow is affecting the ailerons. So in moderate or severe ice, typically mixed icing where you get kind of horns that are coming off the wing, that has the most significant disruption effect on the airfoil. And if that is located near the ailerons, you can get uneven control out of your ailerons and the airplane can roll one way or the other. That's probably part of what happened in the video that we're going to watch, was a combination of some stalling and some roll and some uncontrolled roll action from severe icing. But that is obviously not a good thing, and that is a significant hazard. Tail stalls. By show of hands, how many people off the top of our head know how to recover, what the proper recovery is from a tail stall? Not seeing too many hands. Is it like a wing stall? I see one hand. It's the opposite of a wing stall, exactly right. So a tail stall is...
You'll figure that out quick.
Hopefully you figure that, yes. Hopefully you figure that out quickly, otherwise it's game over. As we may or may not know, the tail of the airplane flies opposite the wings. So the airplanes all have a tendency to nose down. Every aircraft is designed to have a center of gravity that is ahead of the center of lift of the wings. So the airplane is naturally going to point down. That's why we have horizontal stabilizers to push down so that the airplane flies level. So with that design being the exact opposite of a wing, the recovery is the exact opposite. What leads to a tail stall, besides the obvious that you have contamination of your tail surface, is typically the disruption of airflow from the flaps. So the relative wind going over the tail is a function of what flap setting you have. And the wings themselves are driving that air downward on the tail at a downward angle. As you put flaps in, it's forcing that air at a higher angle, so the angle of attack on the tail actually gets bigger when you put flaps down. The tail has to work harder. It's closer to a stall. With a contaminated tail, that can lead to very dangerous consequences when you pull flaps. So most typically the recovery is first retract the flaps, because most often a tail stall happens when you put the flaps down. And then the rest of the recovery technique is let the nose drop, slow down, and then you pull back. You actually want to reduce that angle of attack by pulling back on the yoke, and that's the recovery from a tail stall. So this is the more, just to review, how dangerous icing is, how fast ice contamination can build up. I do want to talk a little bit about, before we watch the video, and then take a break, get a drink, and then we'll talk more specifically about weather briefing and different techniques. Regulations. What are the regulations on icing? Well, there really isn't a defined specific regulation on icing for Part 91 that we all fly. There's only one part of Part 91 that talks about known icing, and that's related to larger turbine, multi-engine, and fractional ownership. The parts of the General Aviation regulations that speak to icing kind of fall under the catch-all buckets. You can't take hazards. You gotta follow the POH. You can't put yourself at unreasonable harm or danger to you or to someone else on the ground. So you have those catch-all buckets, which led to a lot of consternation and debate in the general aviation community, I think about 10 years ago, where AOPA, the main advocate for general aviation, asked the FAA to clarify and define what does known icing mean. And what the FAA came back with, why is that important? Because the question is, if we have an aircraft, and let's say we're IFR rated, or not, what are the consequences besides the obvious of hurting yourself or your property? But if you're confident in yourself and you think that you're not putting yourself at risk, can you still fly through that ice? And the answer that the FAA came back with is no. And the answer that they came back with, say 10 years ago, I'd have to look that up, I might be wrong on that, is even more forceful today because of all of the additional information that's available to predict where icing is and to avoid that icing. Back in the older days, when I wasn't a pilot, but as I understand it, you had PIREPs, you had pilot reports, you had area forecasts, you had kind of winds aloft, temperatures, and that was all you had. Well, what we'll talk about in session 2 is there's a whole new set of data that's available. So the excuse that a reasonable pilot can't identify what constitutes an icing condition is a very narrow argument to make. So bottom line, the FAA has given legal opinions very clearly that if a reasonable pilot using available data would conclude that there would be icing conditions at XYZ area where he's planning to fly, that would be a clear violation of the regulations and one that would actually potentially lead to enforcement action. So the picture I have here is a picture of my Cirrus where I came through some inadvertent icing that I wasn't expecting. And you can see where the TKS system didn't work all the way. It's a non-FEKI system, but that's an example of what I would say is a pretty nominal case of some icing. If we look at the beginning of the presentation here, that's some pretty significant mixed icing right there. That's giving the shoehorns that we talked about right there. Significant disruption to the airflow. All right, let's take a break right here. Let's get another drink, and then we're going to watch about a 10-minute video. It's going to be pretty somber, but it's going to set ourselves up to start talking about the importance and how we use forecasting to avoid icing. All right, everybody, thanks for participating in session 1. Next, we're going to show a YouTube video here of a very tragic incident that sets the stage for why in session 2 we're going to talk in more depth about the information and briefing systems that are available to identify and avoid the icing. So let's watch this video, and then we'll pick up session 2, talk about our observations of what contributed to the accident and what icing and weather forecasting and briefing tools are available to us as pilots. Here we go.
Reports the pilot of the plane may have been doing aerial acrobatics just before.
By no stretch of the imagination are we healed, and we may never be healed.
It's just after 10 a.m. on December 20th, 2011. Morning rush hour is over in the New York metropolitan area, but there's still plenty of traffic on Interstate 287 near Morristown, New Jersey, when a strange sight appears in the gray, overcast sky. Drivers who happen to look up are stunned to see an aircraft spiraling toward the ground in a near vertical dive, trailing smoke. Within seconds, the doomed aircraft plunges into the southbound lanes and wooded median of I-287. Several motorists have no choice but to drive through the fireball. Miraculously, none of them are injured. Their narrow escape is the one bright spot in an otherwise grim situation. All 5 people aboard the aircraft, 2 of them young children, are dead. A multi-million-dollar airplane is destroyed. A major highway is closed for hours, and countless lives are disrupted as a result. Why did it happen? To answer that question, we have to turn back the clock to 9 a.m. as the pilot of November 731 Charlie Alpha, a Cicada TBM 700, is preparing for a flight from Teterboro, New Jersey to Atlanta's Peachtree DeKalb Airport. He's joined by his wife, 2 children, a business associate, and the family dog. The 45-year-old pilot holds a private certificate and instrument rating and has logged over 1,400 hours in 10 years of flying. His total experience in the TBM is unknown, but evidence suggests it may be as much as 700 hours. He takes annual recurrent training in the aircraft and has successfully completed a simulator course in the past month. The flight plan for the trip, filed via DUATS at 7 o'clock that morning, lists an en route cruise speed of 292 knots at flight level 260. There's no indication that the pilot has received an official weather briefing from DUATS or flight service, though it seems likely he's gotten weather information from other unofficial sources. It's 9:30 a.m. when ATC issues an IFR clearance for departure to the southwest. 8 minutes later, the aircraft is cleared for takeoff. At the time of the accident, the most prominent weather feature in the area was a cold front that had moved south across the region earlier that morning. Behind it lay a band of moisture that, in combination with freezing temperatures aloft, created the potential for dangerous icing conditions. The area forecast valid at the time of the accident called for overcast ceilings at 7,000 feet, with tops through flight level 180. In addition, an airmet had been issued advising pilots of moderate icing from the freezing level, which varied between 3,000 and 9,000 feet, to flight level 180 over an area covering most of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Maryland. More worrisome than that rather vague warning, however, were the numerous pilot reports of icing. Just after 8 a.m., an American Airlines MD-83 over Morristown, the site of the accident, made an urgent report of severe rime icing between 14,000 and 16,500 feet. The pilot later stated that conditions were the worst he'd encountered in 38 years of flying. Likewise, the captain of a Canadair regional jet operating near 731 Charlie Alpha at the time of the accident later reported that the rate of accumulation overwhelmed his wing anti-ice system. He estimated that the aircraft picked up 2.5 inches of ice on the protected areas of the wing and 4 inches on some unprotected areas within just a few minutes. That particular report was, of course, not available to the pilot of 731 Charlie Alpha. However, there was no shortage of other PIREPs earlier that morning, several of them from large jet aircraft reporting moderate icing. According to the AIM, icing reaches the moderate level when, quote, the rate of accumulation is such that even short encounters become potentially hazardous. In contrast to the dangers lurking above, weather at the departure airport was quite good, with excellent visibility and a high overcast. And despite all the pilot reports prior to the accident, the weather forecasting system generated no additional warnings apart from a minor update to the existing AirMet. We can't be sure how much the pilot really knew about the weather situation that morning. All we can say is, whatever concerns he may have had, they certainly didn't keep him from departing. It's now 9:55 a.m., and 731 Charlie Alpha is southwest bound, climbing through 8,000 feet on its way to 10,000 when it's handed off to a new controller at New York TRACON.
Departure TBM 731 Charlie Alpha 8 for 10,000.
731 Charlie Alpha, New York departure, maintain 14 14,000.
Going to 1414, 1 Charlie Alpha.
And 1 Charlie Alpha, reports of moderate rime 15 through 17. Light rime said there wasn't a problem with 14. I'll keep you out there. If it gets worse, let me know. And when the center takes your hand off, I'll climb it, and they can get you higher.
Well, Charlie Alpha, we'll let you know what happens when we get in there. Yeah, if we can go straight through it, no problem for us.
Unbeknownst to the pilot, due to the numerous icing reports, officials at New York Center have determined that propeller aircraft filed at 16,000 feet and below should either be rerouted or held at lower altitude until clear of the icing. Presumably, because its filed altitude is flight level 260, 731 Charlie Alpha is not affected by this policy. 3 minutes later, while climbing through 12,800 feet, it's cleared into the heart of the icing.
1 Charlie Alpha, climbing to 17,000, New York Center 134.6.
Going to 34.6 on the way up to 17,000, 1 Charlie Alpha. We're just entering the DMC, right, or the INC right now.
The TBM 700 is a high-performance aircraft. Its 700 horsepower turbine engine allows it to cruise at nearly 300 knots and up to 30,000 feet. It's a capable weather-flying machine, but like any aircraft, it has limitations. Aircraft of this caliber pass through ice all the time, but they rarely linger in it, for the simple reason that their surface ceilings and climb performance make it easy to avoid. Known icing systems offer breathing room in light and moderate icing, but severe ice is an entirely different story. The TBM's operating handbook clearly states that the first step upon encountering severe icing should be to request priority handling from ATC. The reason being that unless a pilot makes a quick getaway, the de-ice boots will be overwhelmed by the rate of accumulation. As ice builds, drag increases rapidly and airspeed falls off. To maintain a climb in this situation, the pilot has to keep increasing the angle of attack, adding to the drag and eventually exposing unprotected parts of the wing to ice. Things can get very bad very quickly. The autopilot poses other dangers. There's no evidence that 731 Charlie Alpha was on autopilot during the accident sequence, but it's worth noting that, when ordered to maintain a certain rate of climb, an autopilot will simply keep pulling back as the aircraft loads up with ice. By the time it abruptly disconnects, or the pilot finally realizes the danger, it may already be too late. By 10:01 a.m., a little over 3 minutes after its pilot reported entering IMC, the TBM is at 16,800 feet and picking up ice.
Our 731 Charlie Alpha, I will have higher for you as soon as I can. You will get some light icing there at 17,000.
1 Charlie Alpha, we can confirm that light icing for you. It's light too, yeah, it's pretty light for now. We've been in here for a little while, and higher when able would be great.
Only 9 seconds later, however, the situation aboard 731 Charlie Alpha has clearly taken a turn for the worse.
It's 731 Charlie Alpha, we're getting a little rattle here. Can we get higher as soon as possible, please?
Yes, stand by.
15 seconds later, the controller has coordinated a climb.
Our 731 Charlie Alpha, climb and maintain flight level 200.
200 for 1 Charlie Alpha, thank you.
It's not entirely clear what the pilot's reference to getting a little rattle, or possibly rattled, means. A post-accident statement from the controller indicates he believes the pilot is simply worried about the icing. But it's also possible the pilot is referring to a noise in the aircraft, conceivably, sounds made by the engine ingesting ice. Accident investigators will later find the switch for the inertial separator, a mechanical device that prevents ice from entering the engine, in the off position. Whatever the case, the pilot begins his climb. Just over a minute later, as the aircraft reaches an altitude of 17,800 feet, it suddenly turns 70 degrees to the left and enters a descent. 20 seconds later, a truncated call is heard on the frequency.
And 731 Charlie Alpha is declaring.
In the 48 seconds before the final ATC radar return, the aircraft falls 15,400 feet. At some point, aerodynamic loads overstress the airframe and cause the right wing and parts of the tail to separate. On the ground at New York Center, the realization that something terrible has happened begins to set in.
731 Charlie Alpha, New York. Hey, you see that code 1031? I think he's having trouble with the icing.
Oh, is it the 731 Charlie?
Down right now.
What's he at right now?
I don't know. I think he's descending.
Oh, he's just doing it on his own?
I think he doesn't want to be. 731 Charlie Alpha, you there?
The crash of November 731 Charlie Alpha is a sobering example of just how quickly things can go wrong in certain weather situations, even for an experienced, well-trained pilot flying a capable aircraft. In hindsight, the immediate temptation is to speculate that an official weather briefing would have left the pilot better prepared for the conditions he eventually faced, and perhaps it would have. But large icing air mitts are a dime a dozen during winter in the Northeast, and it's not hard to imagine the experienced pilot of a turbine aircraft glancing through a list of PIREPs, reaching the conclusion that he'd probably pick up a little ice during the climb and moving on, just as he had dozens of times before. It's also possible that more proactive warnings from ATC, or better integration of pilot reports into the forecasting system, might have made a difference. That said, as pilots, we fly the weather we find, not what was forecast. And it's incumbent upon us to take the initiative with ATC, even, or perhaps especially, in high-density airspace. Sometimes experience harms more than it helps. Rather than making us more vigilant, it can lead to a sort of comfortable complacency, not only about the dangers we face, but about our own capabilities and those of our aircraft. Complacency is arguably aviation's most common vice. And one of the hard truths about flying is that it's sometimes punished with extraordinary severity. The pilot of 731 Charlie Alpha was in the clouds for a total of approximately 5 minutes. Roughly 2 minutes passed between his first indication to ATC that icing was a problem and the beginning of the final plunge. It takes time for the human mind to spin up when suddenly confronted with a problem. It takes time to recognize that things have changed and process the idea that an extraordinary response is called for. All during that time, part of the mind is fighting against the new reality, arguing, stay the course. 2 minutes isn't much time, but it's enough time. Enough time to make a decision, declare an emergency, and reverse the climb. Or just push the nose over and worry about ATC later. Or at least that's what we'd like to think. The truth of the matter, which is that 2 minutes really isn't much time for someone who's surprised, conflicted, and almost certainly frightened, is decidedly less comforting.
All right, certainly a very, very sad, tragic story. It highlights the fact that no airplanes are immune from this, and that we have always need to be vigilant. So next we're going to start session 2 here, which continues on the discussion from this video and the weather forecasting tools. Enjoy. There were several PAVE risk factors at work here. I saw a few at least. One was definitely a little bit of it won't happen to me type of mentality of the pilot going in. The comment he made at the beginning, yeah, it's fine, we're good. I got a TBM, I can fly through ice, it's no problem. I can understandably so, but that was a risk factor that came from the pilot in that scenario. Also, probably a hint of embarrassment and denial, not wanting to have to admit that things are bad. Whether it's embarrassment or complacency, denial, that was clearly there by the pilot. Aircraft-wise, probably not. Last thing, not turning on the inertial separator. If you're flying a turbine engine, I never have, but as far as I understand, that's standard procedure going into icing. Inertial separator comes on. That was not followed. So the pilot had a contributing factor in the risks of this accident. Aircraft, probably not so much. I think that I don't believe anything was wrong with the aircraft. The environment, obviously, terrible weather. You're in a very busy airspace where aircraft are piled on top of each other, which I'm sure contributed to the pilot's mentality to not want to deviate and to make an exception. And external factors. You got your family on board, going to see vacation family. It all adds up to bad decisions that only took a minute and a half or 2 minutes. So that's a TBM, a $2 million airplane. Imagine what can happen to a 172, a Mooney, a Piper, if you fly into some sort of icing. It's over like that. All right. So let's move on to a real world example. We had one this week, just 2 days ago, Monday night, where we had an ice storm here in the Midwest United States in Indianapolis. We had an ice storm that was starting here and it was moving its way out east towards New York. We're going to cover here to finish up the seminar, and then we'll go into some question and answer, and we can gather network after, is weather briefing process. Now, there's not one prescribed way to brief a flight with IFR or VFR if you're worried about ice. There's not one magic way to do it. And in fact, in the last 2 years, things have changed quite drastically with, say, for example, ForeFlight, adding the icing layers to ForeFlight, which wasn't there a few years ago. All these different things have made the prediction and the tools much, much better. So that's good. So what I'm going to lay out here is just an example of some weather briefing tools that are there, and the one that I like the most, because I believe it's the most comprehensive way to look at the predicted weather and to have accessible information that's with you in the cockpit that you can make decisions on. So first, let's look at the weather situation that we had earlier this week. We can see a massive low pressure that was circling counterclockwise, bringing cold air down into Indiana, and then circulating some moist air back up from the Great Lakes through Ohio and Pennsylvania. We can see,
is this just last week's weather?
this is Monday night. This is from Monday night. Two nights ago. Today's December 2nd. This was from November 29th at 11 p.m. Okay, here's a screenshot from SkyVector. How well can you see that? So SkyVector here is a free website that you can visualize winds aloft. You can visualize TAFs and METARs on the ground. So what you can see here are the METARs showing what we saw in the last slide, which had overcast layers as well as pressure gradients. But this one shows the VFR to IFR to very low IFR, and then back to VFR as you would get to New York. By the way, the flight plan that I put in here for these examples is TYQ, Indianapolis Executive Airport in north of Indianapolis, to Teterboro, as just an example. And here we can see the winds aloft. And I want to show these winds aloft because when we talk about Skew LogT charts, we're going to talk about all the different data that's available in one snapshot, which includes all the stuff we're talking about here. So we can it matches the low pressure. This is winds aloft at 10,000 feet, 9 or 10,000, I don't recall exactly, but simulating let's say a typical flight that someone in a GA aircraft, maybe a Cirrus SR-22 that has known ice, flight into known icing capabilities, might take or might file at least a flight plan of this type. Many of us are probably familiar with aviationweather.gov. That's a weather website that provides free data in many different graphical forecasts, both for cloud cover, the bases and the tops and the type of layers in between. It provides time horizons that you can sequence the data from start to 18 hours out, depending on where it's at in the day. And you can layer the data by altitude. So starting at the lowest 3,000 feet all the way up to higher flight levels that, as general aviation pilots, we don't typically have to worry about. So the data is there. It's pretty powerful, right? You can get after it. There's free applications that make it available. So what's the benefit of, in this example, of Skew LogP charts? And by the way, last slide here I have would be the icing. So we can see here at 9,000 feet, we have moderate icing over Ohio and Pennsylvania. So as we look at these charts, we have, so we go from trace to light to moderate. And if we saw a very dark blue, that would be severe icing. Yeah, a little speck of dark blue, a little speck of severe. Good eye. Good eye, Chris. All right, so for me, it's not just accurate information because the information all comes from the same data source. The source data for all of this are weather balloons. So each day, I think it's twice a day, there's like 900 weather balloons that are launched around the world that go up to like 100,000 feet, transmit the data on dew point, temperature, and wind direction back down to Earth. And apparently, they send them up with shipping instructions on how to send them back to the Weather Service. So I'm just waiting to find my first weather receiver. That would be actually pretty cool. So the source data is the same. So if you're going to ForeFlights, you're going to weather.gov, you're going to 1-800-WX Brief, which, by the way, is a very powerful website. It's not just the phone service of the old days. You can do a lot of powerful stuff. I got my iPad. We can demo some things here at the end of this if we'd like to in terms of how filing a flight plan and the type of briefing you can get from that. A lot of data, but for me, the benefit of an app like Skew LogP is it aggregates the important information in a way that to me is most useful for a pilot, especially IFR pilot, trying to avoid ice in an aircraft that isn't capable of climbing right through it. And you're able to package the data offline so that you have it with you as you're flying along. Now, ForeFlight does that now. They used to not to with their briefings. But as we get into this, when you properly understand these charts, there's no way to ForeFlight to package all the same information in a concise way like a LogP chart does. All right, so this is going to get, so we're just going to kind of dive right into it, and then we could even look up some examples here in real time with some Skew LogP chart. By show of hands, who's familiar with using a LogP chart already? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we have about 20% of the group here that's used them before. You guys find it, is that your primary way of mitigating ice? Oh, yeah. One primary way. So let's dive into the basics of a chart and the basics of what this particular app can provide, because this is an app that you can have on your iPhone. It's an app that you can have on your iPad. The way the chart works, it's a logarithmic chart showing temperature and dew point, which in a nutshell tells you everything you need to know about icing, because we need to know when there's visible liquid moisture that's within that ice range of 0 C to, let's call it, minus 20 degrees C. So if you know your temperature and you know your dew point as a function of altitude, as a function of pressure, which is synonymous with altitude, you know everything you need to know about ice. You also get insights into where the worst ice is, because as you look at a chart like this, you can get insights into where inversions are, for example. So temperature inversions, where if you have an inversion, you have warm air on top of cold air, you can have the risk of freezing rain and severe ice in that cold air below the warm air, and or you have the risk of the warm air and updrafts bringing those larger supercooled water droplets higher into the atmosphere. So by having access to these charts, you can see exactly what's happening in the atmosphere. And I can tell you, again, I'm a pretty relatively new pilot. I probably have 700-800 hours over a 3-year period flying in winter conditions, IFR. I've never found these charts not to be like 100% accurate. Like within, it's unbelievable how accurate they are in terms of what they predict and what I've actually experienced when I've flown through those areas. So I have a lot of faith in the data and whatever mechanism they use to model the data into a way to present it in this format. So the basics of the chart are, we have millibars here on the left, okay? We have altitude on the right. This is mean sea level altitude, defined here as pressure altitude. We have a blue line that is dew point, measuring that relative humidity. We have a red line that's measuring temperature. And these lines go from the bottom to the top on a logarithmic scale. So you can see that that this temperature value of 0 at the surface, they organize the chart in a way where you have the non-logarithmic values going diagonal, and the temperature and dew point data is logarithmic, so it's not linear, but it's logarithmic in a way where it's easy to see it and you can present the data. And thinking about, okay, it's exponential or non-exponential, logarithmic or linear isn't important. What's important is understanding where the altitudes are, where the temperatures are, and where the dew point overlaps with temperature. Because if dew point's overlapping with temperature, what do we have? We have visible moisture. So in this example, so that's just to cover the basics of the chart. This particular app gives you a nice feature where you can get a cross-section, a snapshot of the chart every certain miles of a route. So you can log airports into a waypoint, and you can map out these charts on, say, for example, every 50 nautical miles. And then most importantly, this isn't something that you do once on the ground. You can then save them to local memory on your iPad so that you have them when you're up in the air. And you can look at these charts and compare using this map with where am I in space compared to on my GPS, and what does the chart say I should be experiencing, what kind of conditions am I in? Okay? So what do we see here? Let me zoom in here one more time. So this chart is for basically over Indianapolis, all right? So this is, think of it as a column of air sitting at Indy Executive Airport. If I was sitting on the middle of the field looking straight up, what does the column of air above me look like in terms of temperature and dew point as I go from 0 AGL all the way up to whatever it is, very high in the air, all right? And what we can see from this chart is we can see that at the very bottom here, you can see that. At the very bottom here, we have a divergence of temperature and dew point, which means we don't have visible moisture. And we can see that divergence comes across to about 2,000 feet, let's say MSL. So at about 2,000 feet MSL, we have, what would our AWAS say at the airport? Sky conditions, ceiling, 1,000 feet. Because we're at 1,000 feet approximately MSL terrain. So that's about 1,000-foot ceiling right there. The other thing I can tell from this chart is I have, call it 7,000 feet MSL. I got an overcast layer. So I know I got a cloud layer that is 2007. So I got 5,000 feet of clouds that I need to climb through. In a normal GA aircraft, 500 feet a minute on average, let's say, you're going to have a 10-minute climb in IMC to get on top of that. I also know that that's icing the whole way. And this app shades the ice zone in blue. Why do I know that it's icing? Because I know I have visible moisture, and I know that I'm below 0 Celsius, and I'm warmer than minus 20 Celsius. So this is the ice zone here, minus 20, 0 to minus 20, and that blue zone extends from the surface all the way up. All right, if we move on to Ohio, so now we're looking at an area that's starting to get into the hilly terrain of eastern Ohio and Pennsylvania. We have a different chart. And what does this chart tell us? Well, it tells us that there's pretty low ceilings here and that we have higher terrain because the lines don't start till higher mean sea level, which makes sense when we know what we know geographically about eastern Ohio. So, and we looked at the charts earlier that showed very low ceilings, both on the METARs as well as the winds.com website in terms of ceilings. So we have a low deck, and we have very solid visible moisture from about, I need a pointer, about 2,000 feet to about 3,500 feet. And then I could tell based on the convergence is very solid right here, but the convergence spreads out a little bit here, that you have visible moisture, but it's not solid, hard stratus clouds. So we have a very solid stratus cloud layer right here. And then we have some, let's just call it less dense fog that is starting at about, again, 3,000 feet. And I'd say about right there at about 7,000 feet, you actually start to have non-visible moisture. The lines are very close, but they're not overlapped anymore. You're likely getting into some semi-reduced visibility, but not a situation with heavy icing. All right. Let's take a quick look at what's happening at 10,000 feet here. So we can see here at 10,000, it's starting to diverge. At 9,000, they overlap a little bit more. How about here in Indiana at 10,000 feet? We have no icing at all in Indiana because the two lines are separate. So when we go back to the chart at 10,000 feet, excuse me, this is 9,000 feet, it matches what we would expect to see. There's 0 ice risk over Indianapolis at 9,000 feet. And over that part of Pennsylvania, we have moderate icing at 9,000 feet. And for me, actually, yeah, this is where the chart to me is a little more beneficial than things like this, because in my experience, I would trust that chart more than I trust this, that at 9,000 feet where I saw those lines diverging a little bit, in my personal experience, it would have been not moderate icing. It would have been light, it probably would have been light icing or trace to light icing and something like that. So does this match also what we saw earlier with cloud cover? It does. We see down here in the winds.com that we're at about 1,000 to 1,500 there in eastern Ohio, which is what we saw. And we're a little higher. We're blue to green. So we're getting somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000, anywhere in between. It matches what we saw there on the Skew LogP. As we get into Western Pennsylvania, to me, this would be some pretty nasty ice. And how many thousand feet would a pilot have to climb through to get from the start of that ice to the top of it? It looks like a good 10,000 feet of cloud layer. And a lot of that 10,000 feet is right in the heart of the ice zone. So that is some nasty stuff. And as we zoom in here where this goes, as we get to central Pennsylvania, do we have any icing here at all? We actually don't have any ice risk in this column of air. There's zero icing. We have clouds, we have visible moisture, but that visible moisture is warmer than 0 degrees. And as you get into the cold zones, the dew point temperature have diverged. There's no icing. As we get closer to New York, we have a divergence here with just a little thin overcast layer that's probably right there at about 7,000 feet. So that would be just one of those layers where you got a nice 7,000 foot ceiling, and it's probably a really thin ceiling that is out of the cold zone, it's out of the ice zone, and we know it's really thin. So could a reasonable pilot fly through that without any icing equipment? I'd say probably yes. If I was flying an airplane that was not certified for known ice, I would consider that not to be known ice based on the forecasting. That would be a cloud layer that I would fly through, both because of the duration that you're going to be in that visible moisture and the fact that it's forecast to be above the ice zone. Similar thing here as we get closer to New York. To me, that would not be known icing. We're very close to New York. Let's see what the chart showed back here. And it matches what we would have expected to see in eastern Pennsylvania and New York in terms of the ice risk at 900,000 feet. So that's really quick. I figure we could get into like a demo or some questions. I just want to introduce the concept and then get into some question answer, and I get the iPad out and demonstrate some things on whether it's 1-800-WX-BRIEF on Skew LogP. The different references, for those that aren't familiar with advisory circulars, as a relatively new flight instructor, my one takeaway is the FAR AIM is like dipping your finger in the water, and the substance to everything else is in the circulars, legal counsel letters, and precedents that the regulators set when they make decisions on stuff. So we looked at what I referenced here as I was preparing for this was the airport field condition assessments and winter operations safety, mitigating risks of runway overrun upon landing. This is a very good one. Pilot guide, flight into icing conditions. That's a pretty quick read. Highly recommend reading that circular if you haven't already. And this 2009 letter is the benchmark letter where the FAA drew the line in the sand that said, yeah, if the forecasting data would make a reasonable pilot believe that icing would exist, then you are flying in known icing. And if you're doing that in violation of your POH, then you're violating the regulations and you could be subject to enforcement action. The other thing that I think is a really good document is aviation weather that the FAA has put out. Rather than killing your printer, you can buy one for $8. The aviation weather services is decent, but I think it's getting a little bit out of date. And as things change, it's not bad. If you got time, read it. But this is agnostic to technology. This is just theory in terms of understanding weather theory. And in the case of icing, there's good 15 pages that very succinctly describe icing theory and give a good explanation. So I think this is time well spent as a pilot looking at that. So with that said, we can transition into some questions, and if someone would like to see, we could bring up the application in real time and look at a route or look at an airport, look at where we are today, knowing what we have the weather. We could bring up WX 1-800-WX brief if someone would like to see an example of some of these free services that are available outside of ForeFlight to brief weather. All right, folks, I want to thank you very, very much for attending this first Rapid Flight Training YouTube Live seminar. It's going to be the first of more seminars to come on different topics, all things aviation, training, safety. Check us out on social media, rapid.flight.training on both Facebook and Instagram, Rapid Flight at Twitter, and our website will be coming soon in December at rapidflighttraining.com. As we said before, we're focused on fast, focused flight training, primarily in instrument ratings. If you know anyone that is looking to get their instrument ticket, send them our way, and look forward to hosting one of these and participating and interacting with you soon. Take care.